Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. We are looking forward to talking about Rhode Island policy today. I'm here, we have Mal here, and we will start in, well, it's 1:03, so we'll start now. As a reminder, we have Q&A and chat available. So as we go through the presentation, please feel free to just take some notes in the chat if you need any technical support, and jot down any questions you have as we go through the webinar in Q&A so we can address them at the end. We'll start off with the logistics. Everyone is muted to avoid background noise. We will be recording the webinar and we'll start that now. And again, if you have any questions or technical issues, please feel free to type it into the chat or the Q&A. Mal and my information is available right here, and we'll have it again available at the end so that you can follow up with any questions you may have. My name is Kai. I'm Policy Coordinator at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and with me today also is Mal. Mal, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Mal Scoron, and I'm the Transportation Program and Policy Coordinator for Green Energy Consumers, and it's great to see folks here today.
Green Energy Consumers is a nonprofit. We're based in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We've been around in Massachusetts since 1982 and since the mid-2000s in Rhode Island. And we work on both consumer programs to help people in Rhode Island and Massachusetts make greener energy choices like getting electric vehicles or green power. But we also work on policy advocacy so that we can move our states collectively towards a low carbon future. And that's what we'll be talking about today, focused here in Rhode Island and what we're doing and what we need you to do in this legislative session to get some really strong climate policy passed. So I will start off talking about the overview of climate policy in Rhode Island today, as well as some key pieces of legislation on buildings and electricity, and then I'll pass it over to Mal to talk about transportation. And this is a huge week in climate policy in Rhode Island, and we'll get to why that is and what you can do to help support climate policy today and the Thursday. So in Rhode Island, we are thrilled that less than a year ago, we passed an Act on Climate. This piece of legislation set mandatory economy-wide targets of 45% carbon reductions by 2030, 80% by 2040, and net zero by 2050. We are already seeing the impacts of climate change in the ocean state and around the world. These targets are really the bare minimum that science says that we need. We probably need to be reducing our emissions globally much faster than this. But we are doing our best to meet these targets and want to keep Rhode Island to its commitment to do so. The Act on Climate passed, and it was a huge landmark piece of legislation for the environmental community and for our state overall. It is important because the state can no longer stave off action and say that it doesn't have to do anything to climate change. Rhode Island can no longer say that it's up to the federal government or up to someone else to do this work. Rhode Island now has to meet these requirements, and the end result of transitioning to a low carbon future will be better for our natural environments and our communities here in Rhode Island. However, it doesn't mean that that was the last thing we need to do. It empowered the administration to do more on climate, but we still need a lot of legislative approval for key energy programs that are going to help us meet that goal. We're also waiting on the 2022 climate plan that the Executive Coordinating Climate Change Council is putting together. And we hope that that climate plan that is being developed over the course of this year, there's lots of public hearings for you to get involved in that advocacy as well, that plan will show us the path forward on what the administration needs to do to meet the most important, closest goal, which is 45% emissions reductions by 2030. So today we are focused on the legislative session and the legislative process. So here are our top priorities this session for legislation that will help us move the needle on getting to that 2030 goal, which we view as the closest, as most important to meeting right now. Our top priorities are 100% renewable electricity by 2030. This is a bill that would do a lot to help us cost effectively meet that 2030 goal. It would make Rhode Island the first state in the country to reach 100% renewable electricity, and it passed the Senate this year, or last year. So we're really optimistic about getting it passed this year, and it's all hands on deck to make sure that this can happen and that it passes the House as soon as possible. We're also supporting the Electric Transportation Act, which we will talk about more later, but will help us address the source of most of the plurality of emissions in Rhode Island, which is transportation. And we're also focused on offshore wind procurement, which will help us get to that 100% goal and build jobs in our state, as well as funding Act on Climate implementation, because we won't be able to do any of this planning and implementation work if the state is not properly resourced to do it. So zooming a little bit out, I want to make sure that everyone understands the path. When we say we need your help to pass a bill, here is what we mean. First, a senator or representative introduces a piece of legislation. Most of our priorities have been introduced already. For example, 100% is being sponsored by Senate President Dominic Ruggiero and Representative Deb Ruggiero. Different spellings on those last names, but it's very similar, it's very confusing. After a bill has been introduced, it goes to a certain committee, a subcommittee of representatives and senators, rather than the entire General Assembly, who consider the bill, debate it, and take testimony from expert witnesses and the public. After that hearing, the respective senators and representatives in the two different committees, there's a Senate committee and a House committee, they take that testimony, and usually they come out with an amended version of the bill. A sub A is what that's called. And that amended version is voted on by the committee. If the bill receives a vote and it is passed by the committee, then it goes on to the entire House or Senate. And then if it is passed there, then it goes on to the governor. And if the governor signs it, then the bill becomes law. So this process has to happen in each chamber. So a bill receives 4 votes in total if it is to become law. So, and just to highlight where we are in the process for our bills right now, most of our pieces of legislation have not received any hearings yet. So we're really at step 1 here, but many of them have been introduced. And 100% renewable electricity has a hearing this Thursday that we're going to ask you all to come out to support. Transportation is the biggest source of emissions in Rhode Island. So Mal, do you want to talk briefly on this slide before coming back to Electric Transportation Act later?
Yes, I would love to. So I want to start off by saying I think it's often surprising for folks to realize that transportation is the largest source of climate warming emissions in Rhode Island, rather than the electricity sector, which is often what people think of when they think of climate change, because you're visualizing wind turbines and solar power and all of those things that have been really front of mind. And it's worth noting that emissions from the electric sector have been on the steady decline over the last several years because of the existing renewable energy laws that we have on the books. And I'm looking forward to Kai talking a little bit more about how the 100% by renewable energy by 2030 bill will continue that tradition and really accelerate Rhode Island's path to a carbon-free electricity system. But we've seen those laws be really effective. And so now, simultaneously, transportation emissions have not only stayed stagnant over the last couple of years, but actually have increased over time because cars are driving more miles and they're not necessarily getting as clean as we would want them to be. So our focus at Green Energy Consumers is to tackle transportation emissions using a multi-pronged strategy. So we not only need cleaner vehicles, that's cars, buses, and trucks, by electrifying them, we also need to be decreasing the total number of miles that all of these vehicles are traveling on our roads in order to address transportation emissions. And it's worth noting that transportation is also a really large source of health harming pollution as well. And so our ideas to address this sector include expanding incentives for electric vehicles to get cleaner cars on the road. Every state in the US that has higher rates of electric vehicle adoption have some sort of purchase incentive to help get those cars on the road. And Rhode Island hasn't had one since 2017, so that's a really big priority for us, as well as expanding the network of charging infrastructure that there is, so that people can feel comfortable switching and know that they're not going to run out of charge or be able to take a long distance trip in an electric vehicle. We also want to improve and electrify public transit. I'm pleased to say I've seen RIPTA take quite a good number of steps to be able to test out different electric buses and figure out how they can both expand service and integrate electric buses into their fleet. So we're really closely following that work. And we'd also like to see Rhode Island more closely consider how climate emissions are going to be impacted by the federal dollars that are coming in. That's not a legislative priority, but it is really important because we spend billions of dollars on transportation in Rhode Island. And so thinking about how we can reprioritize is a key priority for green energy consumers. With that, I'll pass it back to Kai.
So the next sector of emissions in this graphic is not the biggest source of emissions in Rhode Island, but arguably the most important, which is electricity. And electricity is so important because in order to reduce emissions from all of the other sectors, and primarily transportation and buildings and heating, we're going to have to electrify those other sectors. We can never really have renewable petroleum, renewable gasoline, renewable natural gas heat. And so the secret is to power our vehicles, our transportation, our buildings on clean electricity that has been produced from offshore wind, solar, and other renewable sources. So even though electricity is not the biggest source of emissions, and we've done a good job reducing emissions from this sector over the past decade or two, there's a long way to go. And we can tackle this by getting to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. The foundational policy strategy to accomplish that goal is to pass a 100% renewable energy standard. Talk about what that means in the next slides. We also do need to contract for offshore wind. Offshore wind promises many, many clean energy jobs coming to Rhode Island, and it will be the secret to being able to meet that 100% by 2030 goal. And finally, there's some other little things that we can do to move the needle on 100% renewable electricity, like focusing solar development on rooftops, schools, and carports rather than on open green space, and increasing our energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is always important. It is one of the main reasons that our emissions from electricity has dropped over the past couple of decades. And there's still more to be done, like increasing efficiency in fluorescent light bulbs. So what is actually the second biggest sector of emissions is heating and cooling, which is divided up into all these little categories on this graph, but is actually, when you add them all up, is about 35%, almost equivalent to transportation. That means that buildings are an extremely important source of emissions in Rhode Island that we need to figure out how to reduce. This is very challenging. As with transportation, electrification is key, but there are a number of policies that we do know we can use to reduce emissions from buildings. Reducing emissions from buildings kind of follows along. The approaches are different depending on if we're talking about new buildings versus existing buildings. For new buildings, it's important to have a net zero building code so that we're not building fossil fuel heating systems into our new buildings. A new heating system today could very well last till 2050 when we have to be at net zero emissions. So we ought to be planning now for constructing highly electric, highly efficient buildings. For existing buildings, there are policies like investing more in energy efficiency to incentivize weatherization and insulation. We can also use a tool called performance standards, which works especially well for large buildings to make sure that large buildings are reporting their energy usage and ratcheting down emissions over time. So the Renewable Energy Standard, our top priority for 2022. This is a bill that is sponsored by President Ruggiero and Chair Ruggiero, as I mentioned. 2 years ago now, Governor Gina Raimondo put forth an executive order that stated her goal to reach 100% renewable electricity by 2030. That executive order also resulted in a study by the Brattle Group that showed that this goal is possible and that the foundational strategy to getting there, not the only piece of policy that is needed, but the number one most important policy is the 100% renewable electricity standard. The Renewable Energy Standard is a policy that we've had in Rhode Island since 2004. Now the majority of states in the country have a renewable energy standard, and it has over time slowly increased the amount of electricity that must be renewable that is purchased by the utility company to deliver to Rhode Island customers. It is tracked, renewable energy in the Renewable Energy Standard is tracked through something called renewable energy certificates, which ensure that there's no double counting and that meeting this policy is transparent. The bill that is before us today would simply update the Renewable Energy Standard so that the percentage annual increase in renewable energy required is greater per year so that we reach 100% by 2030. We're currently only at about 20%, so this is an ambitious goal, but we know that we can do it because of the promise of offshore wind in Rhode Island. Again, a year and a half ago, Governor Raimondo announced a 600 megawatt RFP for an offshore wind project. This project would get us most of the way to that goal. This is a little graphic that shows where our current RES is. That's the dashed line along the bottom. The orange line shows a path to 100% and how much renewable energy we would need each year to get to that goal. This orange line is not actually accurate because the current proposed policy is a little bit more of a ski slope. It's an exponential increase so that in 2029, when we have more renewable energy and more ability to meet a big jump up in the standard, the standard will jump up more versus now when renewable energy markets are not quite as they're not as strong as they will be in a few years. There's a smaller jump up in the goal. We do currently have a surplus in renewable energy that we're exporting out of state. So at the very bare minimum this next year, we will no longer have a surplus, which will be great. We'll be using the renewable energy that we produce in state. We do need other policies to get us to this goal. Like I said, we need to make sure that these offshore wind projects happen. We even need more offshore wind. A 1,000 megawatt project is doable. It's in line with what's going on throughout the rest of the region, and would make sure that we can cost effectively get to our 2030 goal. We also want to support more solar, especially solar on rooftops, schools, and developed areas. Like I said, offshore wind is crucial to meeting this goal. We currently have just one upcoming project that has been contracted and fully permitted and is in the process of being permitted. That is the 400 megawatt Revolution Wind project that was jointly entered into a contract with Connecticut. We need more offshore wind. We were so excited that Governor Raimondo announced a 600 megawatt RFP back in fall 2020, and we have seen nothing since then. It has been slowed by the gubernatorial transition last year, as well as the sale of PPL, which we've also been very involved with. So if you have questions on that, we can try to answer those at the end. We support legislation that would require the utility company to procure at least 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Rhode Island used to be a leader on offshore wind. We were the first state in the country with offshore wind, as most of you will know, but we have fallen behind so far. It feels like we've really squandered an opportunity, and we need to try to catch up. We're investing a lot in our ports right now to bring economic development of wind to Rhode Island. let's do some more big contracts and make sure we also get the benefits of clean energy to Rhode Island. And now we'll pass it to Mal to talk about transportation policy.
Thanks, Kai. So for folks that have been following green energy consumers advocacy for maybe the last year and a half, you probably have heard of a program called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI for short. And the idea behind this regional collaboration between multiple New England states, including Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, was to put a price on the pollution that gasoline causes, both climate and health pollution, in order to raise revenue to make the kinds of investments that we need for a clean and decarbonized transportation system. The program would have generated about $20 million a year for Rhode Island alone to be able to buy things like electric school buses, more of those, charging infrastructure across the state. It could have been used to implement the Transit Master Plan or bicycle mobility plans, both of which are severely underfunded by the state's existing transportation spending plan. And it also could have been used to establish a purchase rebate for electric cars in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, all of that is off the table if we don't have a consistent funding source. And back in November of last year, the governors of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island pulled out of the program because they were concerned about the rising gas prices and what the impact of this program would be on gas. Ironically, we're seeing that increase in gas prices anyway because of the conflict in Ukraine. And so Green Energy Consumers is still asking the same question, which is, how can we break out of this cyclical increase and decrease of gas prices that has kept us wedded to a transportation system that is polluting and almost entirely dependent on gasoline and diesel? And how can we start to make the investments that we need to address climate change and give Rhode Islanders real options about how to get around other than the default gas-powered car? So in that chart there, you can see that electric vehicle adoption is increasing across the nation in almost every state, but Rhode Island has been dragging behind all of our neighbors. And so, you might see stats like, there are 500% more EVs on the road this year than there were last year, but the number is so small and that doesn't really mean very much. And it also is behind what other states are managing to accomplish with more EV supportive policies. So the question on Green Energy Consumers' mind is, what is Plan B to fund a transportation system that is decarbonized? And how can we make sure we're transitioning to a future that is not entirely dependent on gasoline? Next slide, please. And the key thing to note there is we know, back one, thanks Kai. We know electric vehicles are coming, and so that's not the concern. The question is, can we make sure that we have enough electric vehicles to stay in line with our 2030 Act on Climate goal? And so I think the graph there is really telling. You can see the number of EVs that we have on the road from 2018 to 2021. It's roughly around 4,600 as of, I think, December of 2021. And we need to increase that substantially by 2025 to meet a goal that was set almost 6 years ago to increase EV adoption. And then we'll need to increase that even more substantially to be able to stay in line with our Act on Climate goal. So the policy levers that we have at our disposal to be able to increase EV adoption fast enough is things like purchase incentives, trying to establish utility programs to decrease the cost of charging for EV drivers, and also make sure that we can manage our electricity grid responsibly so that it's less cost to everyone, and also making sure that we expand charging infrastructure to the extent necessary so that people feel comfortable switching to EVs. And so, without TCI on the table, with the understanding that we need to rapidly increase EV adoption, Green Energy Consumers is making it a priority this year to support what's called the Electric Transportation Act. And you can move on to the next slide. And what the Electric Transportation Act does is it sets a very ambitious goal, not binding, aspirational, to make every car sold in Rhode Island that's new electric by 2030. So what that means is because new cars only make up a small portion of the total vehicle stock in Rhode Island and nationally, we need to really start thinking about a final date by which we'll only be allowing electric cars to come in, so that we can think about almost an entirely electric fleet by 2050. So it sounds kind of ambitious and pie in the sky, like how can we get ready in order to make every electric or every car sold by 2030 an electric car, but this is staying in line with the pace of technological improvement. Lots of countries around the world have already committed to this kind of date, and it's something that's being considered by California. They've already set a 2035 phase out date, and now they're thinking that 2030 is actually more feasible. So setting an ambitious goal like this is really just keeping Rhode Island on pace with the latest technology, but we have a lot to do to make sure that we're prepared for that date. So the Electric Transportation Act is really all about creating a to-do list for everything that Rhode Island needs to do in order to embrace electric vehicles as quickly as possible, so that we can decrease fuel costs for drivers, so that we can stick to our climate goals, and so that we can stay on pace with what the best technology is. Next slide, please. So the Electric Transportation Act does a lot of things. It fits a lot into this planning document, but essentially the key goal is to set up everything Rhode Island needs to do so that every person who's buying a new car by 2030 feels comfortable to make that choice to be electric. So it creates the foundation to establish purchase incentives. It creates a timeline by which the state fleet has to be electrified. It creates a plan to assess our charging needs as a state. And it also sets an ambitious goal for vehicle miles traveled reduction. So what that means is we can't just be replacing polluting cars with cleaner cars, but we need to be investing in our transit and active mobility systems so that the total number of miles that vehicles travel in Rhode Island can go down over time, so that Rhode Islanders have options to be able to get around. So lots of things to help us reach that goal. It also sets a target for school buses to be electric. It establishes a plan to make sure that workers in the industries that will be affected by a transition away from gasoline and to electric vehicles are going to have a transition plan, and start thinking about what workplace training might look like, kind of sets the foundation for everything Rhode Island needs to do. And last slide, Kai, thank you. Within all of those things, there are 4 key sections. So the first is a regulation that would require Rhode Island to adopt the most advanced fuel standards that come out of California in the calendar year that they are released in California. So what that means is California has been the leader in terms of establishing its own fuel economy regulations, because they're the only state that has the power to do so under the Federal Clean Air Act. And so this piece would commit Rhode Island to sticking to California's regulations as soon as they're released. So that just means that there would be no delay, and Rhode Island would be able to start accruing the benefits of cleaner cars, cleaner trucks, and cleaner fleets as soon as California does those things. So Massachusetts has had a law like that on the books since 1992. We think that's a good measure to make sure that Rhode Island doesn't delay, and so that we can start accruing benefits as quickly as possible. The second piece is the preparation piece. So this is where the to-do list for everything that Rhode Island needs to do in order to make a phase out of gas-powered cars starting in 2030 possible. And the icons on the previous screen kind of outlined all of those to-dos. The third piece is all about public input. So this would establish an equity advisory body specifically for clean transportation to help make decisions about what the priorities should be in order to invest in a cleaner system. A good example that's kind of topical is there's lots of conversation going on in the advocacy and transit and environmental community about whether it's more effective to make the bus system fare free, or whether it would be worth it to use that money to instead improve bus service for riders. So we think that with public input from an equity advisory body, it would be easier to make those kinds of decisions when there are trade-offs and a limited amount of resources. And I should say that public body would also be really helpful if Rhode Island does decide to move forward with the Transportation and Climate Initiative program in the future, because then if we do start getting $20 million a year to invest in clean transportation, we have a group that's ready to go to be able to help guide those decisions. And then finally, the fourth piece of the bill is a commitment for the state to electrify all of its new vehicles coming into the state fleet by 2027. This is a timeline that aligns with the Biden administration's timeline to electrify federal vehicles. And so we think that Rhode Island should be moving at least as fast as the federal fleet in order to electrify. We also think that if we're planning to think about what a transition away from gasoline will look like for all Rhode Islanders, then the state really should be leading the way to make sure that it has the expertise and charging facilities available to be able to build up its knowledge, and also make sure that Rhode Island as a whole is ready to move forward to electric vehicles. I just threw a lot of information at you, and it's all new. Green Energy Consumers is really excited to continue to educate about this, but we'll be happy to take any questions about this at the end. For now, I'll pass it back to Kai.
Thank you, Mal. We wanted to shout out a few other bills that we're especially excited about this session. As we have said again and again, solving the climate crisis and getting to our climate goals just in Rhode Island requires so many different pieces of the puzzle, so many pieces working in tandem. We know this about climate change already. And so we are lucky to have so many pieces of legislation before us this session that will help do this. Some of our favorites are the Solar on Schools and Responsible Solar Siting bill that we've been working on with some of our allies in the environmental movement. This bill would protect some of our most important conservation areas, and it kind of rejiggers our solar incentives so that there are bigger incentives for rooftop solar, solar on brownfields, solar on schools, and that most of the incentives are going through the Renewable Energy Growth Program, which has stronger oversight and limits the incentives going through virtual net metering, which is the program that has led to most of the greenfield development that we've seen in Rhode Island so far. Similarly, we want to remove the current limit on rooftop solar. This is the bill that would make it so that you can put as much solar as will fit on your roof on your house. Currently, the utility company caps you at the average of your past energy usage. We want to address the problem of emissions from our buildings, and our favorite bill to do that has been introduced by Rep. Kislak. So thank you, Rep. Kislak, for all of your work on this bill. The Building Energy Performance Standards legislation would require large buildings to report their energy usage to the state, and then start ratcheting down their energy use over time, making sure that they invest in things like energy efficiency and heating electrification. This is a policy that is in place in New York, DC, and Boston, among other places, and we're going to have a webinar in late April just focused on all things building performance standards, which we think is one of the best ways to start decarbonizing buildings. Finally, I wanted to mention a new bill that we're really excited is coming. Last year, we celebrated the passage of appliance efficiency standards, and there's one more little efficiency standard that we didn't get in that bill, but it can really move the needle. This is for light bulbs. Appliance standards are awesome because they take out the most inefficient products in the market. And these are products that often cost more to power on your utility bills than if you just got a more efficient appliance in the first place. But they don't tell you that when you're on the shelves. It's not labeled on the package. So by removing the inefficient products, we're saving people money and we're reducing emissions. And we have a really exciting approach to doing that for light bulbs by regulating them through their mercury content, which is also, of course, toxics benefit as well. We do not do all of this alone. The policymaking process takes policymakers, of course. It takes us, advocates like us, working with campaigns like the Climate Crisis Campaign and the Environment Council of Rhode Island. We also need individual action and community action, and we work closely with justice and equity partners to make sure that our work is grounded in justice and equity. We hope that you will be helping us to support this legislation to fill that key bucket that is individual and community action. There is a hearing for 100% renewable electricity this Thursday at 4:45 p.m. We're requesting everyone show up. Our next slide will contain some key information on how you can support. We also are expecting hearings on Offshore Wind Procurement and Electric Transportation Act later this session. Make sure to follow our blog and subscribe to our emails for notifications on how you can get engaged on that. The Climate Crisis Campaign is the project of the Environment Council of Rhode Island that supports policy specifically focused on moving the needle on climate change. And we encourage you to sign up for those action alerts as well, which you can sign up at riclimatecrisis.org. If you represent an organization or a business, we'd love to have that organization or business signed on as well. So reach out through the Climate Crisis website or directly to me and we can get you involved. So just again, hammering in those details on the hearing on Thursday. Most important is getting written comments into the committee. You can email those written comments as a PDF to House Environment and Natural Resources at rilegislature.gov. Those comments will then be shared with all of the legislators on the committee. We also encourage you to CC your representative and your senator on those comments because those are the people who are likely to listen to you the most. And in your email, make sure to state your name, the bill that you're commenting on, which is H7277, and your position, which is in support. We also are hoping that you'll support the bill in person at the hearing. The State House is now basically fully in person, so we do need to meet in person on Thursday. We're encouraging everyone to wear green and bring a sign showing your support for 100% by 2030. That is because we're trying to keep the spoken testimony program short by request of the sponsor. And so we're trying to show our support by being there in person and showing the legislators that this is a priority for the community. You can stay tuned for future action alerts again by email and our blog. And we want to mention that for the month of March, your donation is matched. So this is a great time to donate to our policy work and all of the programs that we do. You can donate at greenenergydocumsumers.org/donate. So here's all of that information again, our emails, lots of information on our website. And again, it is Thursday, March 10th, this Thursday at 4:45 p.m. that we're requesting your presence at the Rhode Island State House to get out there for 100%. And now we will wrap up our presentation, but have some time for questions. So please put any questions you may have into the question and answer box that should be on your screen.
Yes, we do have plenty of time for questions, as much as 20 minutes. And so while you're sending those in, You can send those questions in about clarifying things, to ask specifically about some of the things that Kai or I might have said, or if we didn't mention something that you're interested in, but is related to green energy consumers advocacy, feel free to ask that as well. I want to get us started off because I have a question for you, Kai, related to the slowing down of offshore wind. You mentioned that the transition from National Grid as the major utility in Rhode Island to PPL has had a role in slowing the procurement process down. And so can you talk a little bit more about that and give the audience an update about what's going on and how Green Energy Consumers has been involved?
So we first learned that National Grid was considering selling its Rhode Island electric and utility businesses to a Pennsylvania-based company called PPL about a year ago. This transaction is part of a larger deal in which this already actually happened, it's approved, it's been done, but PPL is a utility company based in Pennsylvania, as I said. They used to operate some companies in the United Kingdom as well, but they sold those United Kingdom companies to National Grid over the summer. National Grid is actually based in the United Kingdom, so this kind of made sense as a deal for them, but they are still continuing to operate their companies in New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island for now, although they are trying to sell their Rhode Island company to PPL. In order for a utility company sale to go through in Rhode Island, it requires the approval of the Division of Public Utilities. The Division of Public Utilities is a state agency that exists to administer utility regulation, but also to act as the ratepayer advocate. So kind of like an attorney general of sorts for electric and gas utility ratepayers. And starting over the summer and going through till this winter, there has been essentially a court case in front of the division debating the merits of this sale. In order for the sale to be approved, the law says that the division has to find that it is in the public interest of Rhode Islanders. Past precedent has established that the public interest means that there is no net harm to Rhode Islanders. Throughout this case, we have been arguing two things. First, that PPL would be not as good as National Grid at administering certain legally required clean energy programs like energy efficiency or offshore wind procurement. And thus the transaction would cause net harm to Rhode Islanders because PPL would be worse than National Grid. To us, that means that the transaction is not in the public interest. We have a bunch of evidence that shows that PPL doesn't have the experience or shared resources that National Grid does for administering clean energy programs. Second, we've been arguing that the Act on Climate requires the Division of Public Utilities to take climate into account in this decision. So that was not really focused on PPL and National Grid so much as just saying like, hey, we have an Act on Climate now that says that the climate crisis matters for every state decision that is made. Just a couple weeks ago, at the end of February, the division came out with its order, and the division concluded that the transaction did not cause net harm to Rhode Islanders, and so approved the transaction to PPL. This was despite the fact that every other intervener in the case, which included Green Energy Consumers, the Attorney General, and other interveners, other environmental interveners like Conservation Law Foundation and more, were opposed to the sale because we decided it wasn't in the public interest to Rhode Islanders. So really disappointing decision. Of note, the division said that it didn't have to consider Act on Climate until a different state agency told it what it was supposed to do with Act on Climate. But it's not over yet, and that's because the Rhode Island Attorney General has decided to take this case to a higher court, the Superior Court. And meanwhile, the Massachusetts Attorney General has asked in Massachusetts, there was also a similar permit that was required, asked for a stay on the transaction until there can be more clarity about whether or not this is in the public interest of people throughout the region. So right now we're kind of in a holding pattern as we wait for this to go through the courts. I can't give much more of an update on it now, other than that we do continue to oppose the sale, but we just don't have time to let this continue holding up energy policy. We need to make our utility company, whether it's National Grid or PPL, go out to bid for offshore wind, buy renewable electricity. For now and for the foreseeable future, until this is figured out, National Grid is our utility company, and we can't shy away from making sure that they go out and procure offshore wind and administer strong energy efficiency programs as required by law. So I will stop there on that long answer, but this is something we've been really focusing on, so wanted to give that its due diligence.
No, that was an appropriately long answer for, I think, a pretty complex question, and I appreciated that, that background that you provided. There is a question that has come into the chat, which I'll read out loud. It asks, is the electrification ramp up being coordinated with the utility? Do they have a position on this? And will there be any major problems such as inability to meet demand? That is a great question, especially in the context of the background that Kai just gave us on the transition from National Grid to PPL. I'll start off by saying that National Grid has been really great at being a partner in supporting electric vehicle adoption, not just in Rhode Island, but in both Massachusetts and New York. And the reason for that is electric vehicles can be a real asset to the electricity system, rather than, I think, the reputation that they often have, which is they're going to cause more stress to the electric system. It's actually the opposite, because electric vehicles consume electricity, and they're mostly charged at nighttime when there's plenty of excess electricity that can be used to power them. So really, they provide more money to the electricity system than it costs to support them. And that's something that we've seen not just in Rhode Island, but in California and other states that have a lot of electric vehicles. There hasn't really been a problem in terms of integrating them into the larger system. But that's largely because state policy is encouraging adoption of electric vehicles in a way that can help us utilize all of those benefits, including the benefits to the electric system. So National Grid has been really forward thinking in terms of establishing charging programs to help businesses and apartment buildings and workplaces install charging with their support. And so they've been on top of it, helping to expand charging and also making sure that their system is prepared to support all the EVs that are coming on the grid. The problem is we don't know if PPL will really have that experience coming into Rhode Island. Pennsylvania and Kentucky are not really known for their electric vehicle adoption or their EV supportive policies. So we're not quite sure what experience PPL is going to be bringing to the table. But the point of the Electric Transportation Act is to provide clarity about where the EV market is going in Rhode Island, so that the utility company, whether it's National Grid or PPL or any utility company really, is prepared to meet that demand, because they know how many EVs they can expect in 2030, and they have clear direction from the General Assembly about what they need to do in order to prepare. So we see the Electric Transportation Act as the foundation to make that ramp up possible, but it's not just setting an ambitious goal without a roadmap to get there. It's really focused on the preparation and what needs to be done so that we can add EVs to the system in a way that benefits EV drivers and also everyone who is still in a gas-powered car.
Mal, I'm wondering if you could speak to equity in electric transportation. I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of the gas car phase-out approach is how this is an equitable policy, given that currently some electric cars, or at least they have the reputation of being more expensive than gas cars.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main thing to note about a policy like this is that most Americans never buy a new car in their lifetime. So what that means is the purchase decisions of people that are buying cars on the used market is entirely dependent on the cars from 3 to 15 years ago that were new then and have now transitioned to the secondhand market. I myself bought a used EV and I live in Rhode Island, but I had to travel to Massachusetts to buy it because there just weren't enough new electric cars in Rhode Island for there to be a good option for me to buy a used EV here. So I had to travel out of state. And so the idea behind the Electric Transportation Act is we need to focus on electrifying new car sales, which are predominantly like those purchase decisions are made by higher income Rhode Islanders, so that we can make sure that there's a steady increasing supply of electric cars on the secondhand market starting in 2030 and beyond. So unlike purchase incentives can help do that, but committing to a phase out date is a really useful tool in the toolbox so that we're not leaving Rhode Islanders behind in the transition to electric cars. Because the fact is, we need new electric cars in order for there to be used electric cars. And so this bill kind of sets the groundwork for making sure that everyone will have access to an electric vehicle at their price point, whether it's new or used, starting at least in 2030. And we do expect electric car sales to increase over time, but again, we have to make sure that we're aligning that transition with our climate goals. And so the Electric Transportation Act kind of threads all of those pieces together. And then the last point that I just want to add is electric cars are great. Used electric cars are even better, but not everyone needs or wants a car. And so a big component of the equity piece in the Electric Transportation Act is acknowledging that options to electrify transit and school buses are going to be really important so that we can deliver on the climate and air quality benefits of EVs to everyone, regardless of whether they own an electric car or not. So again, it does kind of multiple things, but kind of plants the seeds for that conversation so that we have a robust electric car market here in Rhode Island and we're not left behind and kind of forced to grab the scraps from Massachusetts, which is much further ahead of us in terms of how many electric cars that they have.
Awesome.
That was a great question. I appreciated that.
We have a next question, which is around solar panels and parking. So our solar incentives are weird. We have like 4 different programs. It makes no sense. It would be better if we just had one unified solar incentive program that aligned with our policy priorities. But sometimes policy making gets weird. And the situation with our current solar panel incentives for carports, which this question is about, is that our renewable energy growth program gives leeway to the utility company and to other entities, the oversight agency for the incentive program, to come up with their own categories of renewable energy projects that they want to propose, and then the Public Utilities Commission has to approve it. So a couple of years ago, everyone got together and said, wouldn't it be awesome if we put solar over our parking lots, because that will have solar and we won't be cutting down trees, we'll have shade for our cars. Great idea. We can power electric vehicles with the solar panels. Incredible. There was a pilot program for that, but subsequently the Public Utilities Commission rejected funding for this program. And the utility company had been supporting it, but now they're deciding not to propose that type of program again because they know that the Public Utilities Commission is going to reject it. So that is why it's a little more complicated than that, but we need legislation that requires the Public Utilities Commission to accept a category for solar carport funding. And luckily, there is a bill on the table that would do that. That is the solar responsibility bill that I mentioned. It's all about responsible siting of solar and focusing our solar incentives on developed areas like carports, schools, brownfields, and rooftops. So I don't think their ask can really be blocked, but it would have been blocked by the Public Utilities Commission anyway. So we really need a legislative fix allowing solar carports.
Great. Well, it seems like we're wrapping up with the end of the hour. There was a question that came in related to getting a copy of this presentation and where you might be able to find it. So please be on the lookout for an email that's a follow-up from us at Green Energy Consumers that'll have this slideshow as well as the recording, so that if you know someone who you think would be interested in this, you can pass it along, or you can just reference the information that we had in the PowerPoint when you need to. So if you're planning on writing your testimony for 100% renewable electricity this week, we'll make sure that to get you the instructions on how to send that in so that you can do that. But with that, Kai, any closing thoughts about Rhode Island's climate and energy policy for this year?
I hope to see everyone at the 100% by 2030 hearing on Thursday at the State House at 4:45.
Awesome. That's a great note to end on. Thank you all so much, as always, for spending an hour of your afternoon with us. And our emails are on the screen, so feel free to send us any follow-up questions if you think of one later. But with that, thanks so much for joining and have a good rest of your afternoon.